Welcome to another edition of Free Thinking Forum. I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. Well, first of all, what is a free thinker and what's a humanist? And who better to talk about that than the great novelist and Unitarian and humanist, Kurt Vonnegut. Let me read a little bit. Do you know what a humanist is? My parents and grandparents were humanists, what used to be called free thinkers. So, as a humanist, I am honoring my ancestors, which the Bible says is a good thing to do. We humanists try to behave as decently, as fairly, and as honorably as we can without any expectation of rewards or punishments in an afterlife. My brother and sister didn't think there was one. My parents and grandparents didn't think there was one either. It was enough that they were alive. We humanists serve as best we can the only abstraction with which we have any real familiarity, which is our community. Vonnegut goes on to say, human beings have had to guess about almost everything for the past 1,000,000 years or so. The leading characters in our history books have been our most enthralling and sometimes our most terrifying guessers. May I name two of them? Aristotle and Hitler. One good guesser and one bad one. And the masses of humanity through the ages, feeling inadequately educated just like we do now, and rightly so, have had little choice but to believe this guesser or that one. How do we go about thinking? It's a good question. Once a man went to a doctor and he said to the doctor, "Doctor, I'm dead." The doctor said, "Sir, you can't be dead." "Yes, doctor, I am. I'm dead." The doctor said, "Well, how can I prove to you that you are not dead?" The patient thought for a while and he said, "I know, dead people are not ticklish, so tickle me." The doctor tickled the man, and the man said, "Doctor, I was so wrong. Dead people are ticklish." Now that joke tells us a little something about how we go about thinking, because the man was not going to be reasoned out of his belief that he was dead, no matter what kind of evidence the doctor was going to set about giving him. He was going to stay convinced that he was dead. Well, that's interesting when we start to think about what do we believe that maybe isn't quite as true as we might think. The great writer Jonathan Swift had this to say: "It is useless to attempt to reason a person out of a thing he was never reasoned into." It is useless to attempt to reason a person out of a thing he was never reasoned into. Now think about that for a moment. The man had not reasoned himself into thinking that he was dead. He had not taken any kind of stock about that. He had not sought out any evidence about that. He had decided from his gut that he was dead. So the doctor was never going to be able to reason him with facts, never able to reason him out of the belief that he was dead. This is one aspect of thinking that we have to think about a little bit. We have to say to ourselves, what do I think I know because I've always thought so? What do I think I know because I feel that? And should I be thinking that? And Jonathan Swift, the great writer, thought probably not, as a matter of fact. So how do we go about thinking our way out of thinking things that are not real or true? That's a very difficult thing to do. The great British social anthropologist Mary Douglas had a wonderful theory about how institutions work. She thought that people get together in institutions in order to, first of all, form groups in cohesion because we agree on certain things. And then, after we do that, we use the institutions to do our thinking for us. Now, wait a minute, you say, that's not how to go about thinking, but what if we can come up with an institution that is about not believing in institutions? What if we have an institution that would convince us that we have to think for ourselves? That would be an interesting institution, wouldn't it? Let's listen to what the British social anthropologist Mary Douglas had to say about institutions. She said, "Inside a religious body, you get sects and hierarchies. Inside an information network, you get bazaars and cathedrals. It's the same, call them what you like. They survive by pointing the finger of blame at each other." They survive by pointing the finger of blame at each other. Now, is that all that an institution can do? And if so, is an institution a good thing? We can certainly think a little bit about the United States as a government. We point our fingers at our enemies sometimes, don't we? And our enemies love to point their finger at us as well. Interesting that Mary Douglas was correct about that. Okay, so we join an institution, or maybe involuntarily join, as most people born into a nation do, and suddenly we offload our thinking into this institution and say, okay, government, you can think about certain things for me, and you tell me what I should believe. Is that a good idea? Well, probably not. Probably not. Now, the anthropologist Douglas also said, she has a very famous theory about what she called dirt. That is taboos. One of the things that people do in order to form groups is to decide who is in and who is out. And one of the ways to do that is to say what's gross about other people or other things. And when we get a group together that agrees on what's gross, well, then we have an institution, then we have a group. We can even have a society or a tribe that builds itself around that idea. And Mary Douglas was very careful not to talk about primitive tribes versus modern societies. She didn't think things actually work that way. She thinks that people are always basically the same in the way that we react. And so, for example, food taboos. Some people can't eat with other people because of what they find gross or unclean or unholy about food. Fish eyes, for example. Many cultures think that fish eyes are a wonderful delicacy. Others think it's the grossest thing imaginable to eat. Now, are people who think fish eyes are gross for supper going to want to go over to the house of someone who serves fish eyes for supper? Probably not. And that therefore prevents, according to Mary Douglas, the kind of companionability that would get people outside of one group and inside another group. Now you can see how this would work on all kinds of social elements in the way people think. How we dress, how we sit in particular social situations. Do we look at each other in the eye or not when we talk to each other? Do we talk loudly to each other or do we talk softly to each other? Many different ways that we can have an in and an out. And remember, she says that we form these institutions and then those institutions survive by pointing the finger of blame at each other. Now, as I asked earlier, is that a good thing to do? And I would argue that it's probably not a particularly good thing to do. So how do we get outside that? That's one of the reasons that people gather in congregational units. We don't have a lot to say about what our government, an institution we are part of, actually does. We can certainly protest or vote for, but we don't have a lot of choice finally. So if we want to express our opinions and if we want to think outside the box, we have to find an institution that is in some ways an anti-institution, a place that would fight against the telling us that it's just fine to think these preconceived prejudices, if you see what I mean. And one of those things are congregations, groups of people who form to become Unitarian Universalist congregations, humanist congregations. But we can get together and think about how we can go about thinking. Now, here's another quote for you. The great pragmatist philosopher and psychologist William James had this to say: "A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices." A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices. Now think about that, and a little bit about Mary Douglas's point about how we join institutions. Do we get into an institution with our prejudices? We don't like fish eyes, or we do like fish eyes. Well, yes, we do. Then how do we think when our prejudices are being reinforced? Or do we just cease to do that and begin to merely rearrange our prejudices? We might move them around a little bit, but we're not going to actually question them. Well, that's one of the things that great thinkers give us, is that opportunity. Mary Douglas formulated her idea of dirt in order to point out how we human beings think about the ins and the outs of our social groups. After we are armed with that kind of information, we can begin to question the idea of institutions. We can say, along with Mary Douglas, it looks to me like maybe institutions survive by pointing the finger of blame at other institutions. And that can be anything from baseball teams to religious denominations, etc., etc. It's a very interesting way to go about thinking about how we go about thinking. Are we thinking, or are we taking prejudices for granted? What about the flat earth, for example? At one time, it was a truth. Everyone in your group would have said the earth is flat. Then someone was able to think outside that prejudice, that false belief system, and say, wait a minute, I think that maybe the earth is not flat because this oddity of the sun moving and different times of years being in different places indicates that maybe we are on some sort of globe. The people with prejudices are going to say, no, that can't be the case. That person is outside of our group. He must not be thinking in a holy or sacred way. He's not thinking in the tradition. There's something wrong with him. How do they survive? They begin to point fingers. Of course, then, you're going to begin to get the scientific types who do agree with this, pointing their fingers right back again, saying, no, it's you guys who are wrong. So both sides begin to point the finger of blame at each other. This is another aspect of an anti-institution institution. At First Unitarian Society, one of the things we try to do is not point a finger of blame at people, but only at the institutions. The institution of racism, the institution of low wages that don't allow people to live decently, etc. So if we begin to think of it that way, people then are not bad.